The shovel struck something that shouldn't exist 20 feet down in barren soil. Sterling Rhodes froze, sweat dripping from his weathered face as he stared into the hole he'd been digging since dawn. The sound wasn't rock or root. It was hollow, metallic, wrong. After 3 days without finding even a trickle of water, this was the last thing the struggling ranch needed. He knelt at the edge of the well, brushing dirt away with trembling hands. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the dry landscape, but down in that hole, something glinted. Sterling's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what he was seeing. Metal, carved metal, ornate patterns that had no business being buried in the middle of nowhere. "What in the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that swept across the empty plains. The ranch house sat a quarter-mile away, its weathered wood siding bleached gray by years of unforgiving sun. Clementine Shaw would be expecting water by evening. The cattle were dying, the crops were failing, and the bank would come calling within the month. Sterling had promised her this well would save them. Instead, he'd found something that made his skin crawl with unease. He lowered himself deeper into the hole, his boots finding purchase against the rough walls. The object was bigger than he'd first thought, much bigger. As he cleared away more soil, intricate engravings became visible, symbols he didn't recognize, craftsmanship that spoke of wealth beyond anything this desolate stretch of land had ever seen. Sterling's mind raced. Who would bury something like this out here? And why? The nearest town was 2 days' ride through territory that barely supported rattlesnakes and scorpions. No mining operations had ever worked this area. No settlements had ever thrived here. Yet someone had taken the time to bury this elaborate chest 20 feet underground. The metal was warm to the touch despite being buried so deep. Sterling ran his fingers along the edges, searching for a way to open it. The engravings seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light that filtered down from above. His breath came in short gasps as he worked to free the mysterious object from its earthen prison. A sound made him look up. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching fast from the east. Sterling's blood went cold. Nobody came out this way. Nobody had any reason to be here. He scrambled up from the hole, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against a pile of dirt. Through the heat shimmer, he could make out 3 figures on horseback, riding hard toward the ranch. They moved with purpose, like men who knew exactly where they were going. Sterling's throat went dry as a terrible thought crossed his mind. How could they possibly know what he'd just found? Sterling dropped into the well and threw dirt over the exposed metal, his hands working frantically as the hoofbeats grew closer. His rifle lay within reach, but 3 against 1 were odds no sane man would take. The riders pulled up near the ranch house, dust swirling around their horses as they dismounted with practiced ease. From his position in the hole, Sterling could hear voices carrying on the wind. Hard voices, the kind that belonged to men accustomed to taking what they wanted. He pressed himself against the earthen wall, trying to make sense of their words, but they were too distant. What he could see made his blood run cold. These weren't drifters or cattle thieves. Their clothes were too fine, their horses too well bred. The front door of the ranch house slammed open. Clementine's voice rang out across the yard, sharp with anger and fear. "Get off my property. You have no business here." One of the men laughed, a sound that made Sterling's skin crawl. "Ma'am, we're not here to cause trouble. We just need to ask some questions about your hired hand. Where might we find Sterling Rhodes?" Sterling's throat constricted. They knew his name. They'd come looking for him specifically. But how? He'd been nobody his entire life, a drifter who worked for food and shelter, moving from ranch to ranch as opportunities arose. The only people who knew he was here were Clementine and the handful of folks in the nearest town. "Sterling's working the back pasture," Clementine lied smoothly. "Won't be back until sunset. What do you want with him?" "Let's just say he's come into some valuable information. Information that belongs to other people." Sterling's mind raced. What information? He'd never seen these men before in his life. The only thing different about today was the discovery in the well. His eyes fell on the hastily covered metal object beneath the dirt. Could they somehow know about this? "I don't know what you're talking about," Clementine said, but Sterling could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Sterling's just a ranch hand. He doesn't know anything valuable. Ma'am, we have reason to believe otherwise. You see, we've been tracking someone who has something that doesn't belong to him. Someone who might have recently made a discovery that's drawn some unwanted attention." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. They did know. Somehow, impossibly, they knew about the buried chest. But that was impossible. He'd only just found it minutes ago. Unless... His blood went cold as a new thought struck him. What if he wasn't the first person to find it? What if someone else had discovered it, dug it up, and then reburied it? Then, what if these men had been watching, waiting for someone to come along and finish the job? We'll wait, the man continued. And if Sterling doesn't show up by sunset, we'll start looking for him ourselves. This property isn't that big. Sterling closed his eyes, trying to think. The chest was still down here with him, buried under a thin layer of dirt. If these men knew about it, they'd eventually search the well. But if he tried to run now, they'd see him. He was trapped 20 feet underground with nowhere to go. Then he heard something that made his heart stop. The sound of a shovel being picked up from beside the well. Sterling pressed himself against the well wall as footsteps approached from above. Through the circle of light, he could see a shadow moving across the opening. One of the riders was examining his digging site, and Sterling held his breath as dirt began to fall around him. "This well's fresh," a gravelly voice called out. "Somebody's been working here recently. Real recently. Check it," another voice commanded from near the house. "If Rhodes found what we think he found, it'll be down there." Sterling's hand moved slowly toward his rifle, but he knew it was useless. The moment he made any noise, they'd know exactly where he was. The chest lay buried beneath a thin layer of dirt at his feet, and he could feel sweat dripping down his back as he waited. A rope dropped into the well. Then boots appeared at the edge, and Sterling watched in horror as one of the men began to descend. The stranger was lean and hard-looking, with scars crisscrossing his hands and a gun belt worn smooth from years of use. His eyes swept the well methodically, taking in every detail. "Well, well," the man said, his voice echoing off the earthen walls. "What do we have here?" Sterling knew he had seconds before the man spotted him pressed against the opposite wall. His mind raced through his options: fight and die, or surrender and hope they'd let him live. Neither choice seemed promising. "Find anything, Harlan?" the voice from above called down. So this was Harlan Briggs. The name meant nothing to Sterling, but the way the man moved suggested he was accustomed to violence. Harlan kicked at the loose dirt near Sterling's feet, and his boot struck the buried metal with a hollow ring. "Got it," Harlan said, a satisfied smile spreading across his weathered face. "Our friend Mr. Rhodes has been busy." That's when Sterling made his choice. He stepped out from the shadows, rifle raised but not quite pointed at the intruder. "Don't move." Harlan's hand froze halfway to his gun. His eyes narrowed as he studied Sterling, taking in his desperate expression and the way his hands shook slightly. "Sterling Rhodes, I presume. You've caused us quite a bit of trouble. I don't know who you are or what you want, but you're trespassing on private property. What I want is what you found buried down here. What I want is what belongs to my employer." Harlan's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "See that chest you just uncovered? It was stolen from a train 20 years ago. My employer has been looking for it ever since." Sterling's throat went dry. A train robbery. That explained the elaborate craftsmanship, the valuable metal, the remote burial site. Someone had hidden stolen loot out here and never come back for it. "I didn't steal anything," Sterling said. "I was just digging a well." "Oh, I believe you. Wrong place, wrong time. But that doesn't change the fact that you're now in possession of stolen property worth more than this entire ranch." From above, Sterling could hear Clementine's voice sharp with worry. "What's going on down there?" Harlan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your boss lady's getting nervous, and my partners up there, they're not as patient as I am." Sterling's finger tightened on the trigger, but Harlan seemed unconcerned. "Here's what's going to happen, Rhodes. You're going to help me dig up that chest, and then we're all going to have a conversation about how this ends. And if I refuse," Harlan's smile widened, "then Miss Shaw up there is going to have a very bad day." Sterling lowered his rifle slowly, the weight of Harlan's threat settling in his chest like a stone. Above them, he could hear one of the other men talking to Clementine, his voice too quiet to make out the words but the tone unmistakably menacing. "Smart choice," Harlan said, holstering his own weapon. "Now let's see what we're dealing with." Together they began clearing dirt from the buried chest. It was larger than Sterling had initially thought, nearly 3 feet long and ornately decorated with engravings that spoke of wealth and craftsmanship. The metal was some kind of alloy that had resisted corrosion despite decades underground. 20 years, Harlan said, running his fingers along the intricate patterns. 20 years we've been looking for this. "Who's we?" Sterling asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Men who don't like to lose things that belong to them. Men who have very long memories. Harlan produced a small key from his vest pocket. The trainmaster who lost this cargo? He's been funding our search ever since. Said he'd rather die poor than let the thieves who took it keep what they stole. The key turned with a soft click, and the chest opened with a creak of old hinges. Sterling's breath caught in his throat. Gold coins filled the interior, along with rolled documents tied with ribbon and several pieces of jewelry that caught the light filtering down from above. Railroad payroll, Harlan explained, meant for workers building the Western Line. When it went missing, a lot of good men went without wages. Some died that winter because they couldn't afford food or shelter. Sterling stared at the treasure, his mind reeling. If this belongs to the railroad, why not just return it? Why all the threats? Harlan's expression darkened. Because the men who stole it are still alive, still free, and they're not going to just hand it over when they find out we've recovered it. What men? The Shaw family. The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. He looked up toward the ranch house, where Clementine's voice could still be heard arguing with the other riders. That's impossible. Clementine's husband died 2 years ago. She's been struggling to keep this place running ever since. Robert Shaw wasn't the saint his widow thinks he was. He and his brother organized the robbery, then buried the chest out here when things got too hot. Robert died in a riding accident before he could come back for it. And his brother disappeared into Mexico. Harlan's voice was cold, matter of fact. But we always suspected Robert might have told his wife where it was hidden. Sterling's throat went dry. She doesn't know. She hired me to dig a well because the ranch is failing. If she knew about this treasure, why would she be struggling? Maybe she's a better actress than we gave her credit for. Or maybe Robert took the secret to his grave. Harlan began loading the gold back into the chest. Either way, she's about to find out what her late husband really was. From above, a gunshot cracked across the afternoon air. Sterling's blood went cold as Clementine's scream echoed down into the well. Sounds like my partners are getting impatient, Harlan said calmly. Time to go have that conversation I mentioned. Sterling grabbed Harlan's arm. You said you wouldn't hurt her. Harlan's smile was predatory. I said she'd have a bad day if you didn't cooperate. You cooperated, but that doesn't mean the day's over. Another shot rang out, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Sterling climbed out of the well behind Harlan, the chest secured with rope between them. What he saw at the ranch house made his stomach lurch. One of Harlan's men had shot the lock off the front door, and Clementine stood on the porch with her hands raised, her face pale but defiant. Mrs. Shaw, Harlan called out as they approached. I believe it's time we had an honest conversation about your late husband. I don't know what you're talking about, Clementine said, but Sterling could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Her eyes fixed on the chest they carried, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. This chest was buried on your property, ma'am. Buried deep and careful-like, by someone who knew these lands well. Harlan set the chest down on the porch steps. Your husband Robert was one of 3 men who robbed a railroad payroll 20 years ago. This is what they stole. Clementine's face went white. That's a lie. Robert was a rancher, nothing more. Robert Shaw, Marcus Shaw, and a man named Billy Creek, Harlan continued relentlessly. They hit the westbound train outside Copper Falls, killed 2 guards, and made off with enough gold to set them up for life. Marcus fled to Mexico. Billy turned up dead in a river a year later. And Robert came home and played the part of a respectable rancher. Sterling watched Clementine's composure crumble as the words sank in. Her hands shook as she lowered them, and tears began to stream down her cheeks. He told me he'd inherited money from his father back east, she whispered. Said that's how he could afford to buy this land, stock it with cattle. Blood money, Harlan said without sympathy. Every acre of this ranch was bought with stolen gold. Every cow, every fence post, every nail in this house. I didn't know, Clementine sobbed. I swear to you I had no idea. Sterling found his voice. Even if that's true, what does it matter now? Robert's dead. The money's been found. Take it and go. Harlan shook his head. It's not that simple. You see, there's still the matter of interest. 20 years of interest on stolen property. And then there's the cost of our investigation, the time we've spent tracking this down. He gestured toward the struggling ranch. This property and everything on it belongs to the railroad now. You can't do that, Sterling said. She had nothing to do with the robbery. She's been living off stolen money for 20 years. Every improvement to this ranch, every head of cattle, every bushel of grain, all of it paid for with blood money. Harlan's voice was cold as winter wind. The law will see it our way. Clementine sank down onto the porch steps, her world collapsing around her. What about the bank loan? The mortgage payments I've been making? Payments made with money earned from a ranch bought with stolen gold. It all goes back to the railroad. Sterling's anger flared. So what happens to her? You leave her with nothing? Harlan shrugged. That's not my concern. My job was to recover the stolen property and make sure justice was served. One of Harlan's men stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. Course, there might be other arrangements we could make. Pretty woman like her shouldn't have to worry about where her next meal's coming from. The suggestion hung in the air like poison, and Sterling felt something snap inside him. But before he could move, Clementine stood up, her tears gone and steel in her voice. There's something you don't know about that robbery. Harlan's expression sharpened as Clementine straightened her shoulders, the fear in her eyes replaced by something harder. Sterling had never seen this side of her before. This woman who could stare down armed men with nothing but her voice as a weapon. Robert kept journals, she said, her voice steady now, hidden in the cellar. He wrote down everything about that robbery, including details you might find very interesting. What kind of details? Harlan asked, though his casual tone didn't fool anyone. The kind that explain why there were only 2 guards on a train carrying that much gold. The kind that detail exactly how 3 small-time ranchers knew which train to hit and when. Clementine's smile was cold. Robert wasn't just a thief, Mr. Briggs. He was a man with a guilty conscience who wrote down names. Sterling watched Harlan's face change as the implications sank in. You're saying it was an inside job. I'm saying Robert wrote down the name of the railroad official who told them about the payroll shipment. The man who made sure security was light that day. The man who took his cut of the gold and then spent 20 years hunting down his partners to cover his tracks. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. One of Harlan's men shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his gun, but Harlan held up a warning finger. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Shaw. It's not an accusation, it's documented fact, written in Robert's own hand and signed with his name. Clementine took a step closer to the chest. Tell me, Mr. Briggs, who exactly is paying you to recover this gold? Which railroad official hired you to track down these terrible criminals? Sterling's mind raced as he put the pieces together. The fine clothes, the good horses, the resources to fund a 20-year search. This wasn't railroad justice. This was someone covering their tracks. You're working for him, Sterling said. The inside man. He's been hunting down the other robbers to eliminate witnesses. Harlan's jaw tightened. You're both making dangerous assumptions. Am I? Then you won't mind if I ride into town and send a telegram to the railroad authorities. I'm sure they'd be very interested in these journals Clementine mentioned. Sterling moved slowly toward his horse, watching Harlan's reaction. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to handle this privately. Nobody's going anywhere. One of Harlan's men snarled, drawing his weapon. But Harlan held up his hand again, his mind clearly working through the new situation. The journals. Where are they? Safe, Clementine said. Somewhere you'll never find them without my help. And what exactly do you want in exchange for that help? Clementine glanced at Sterling, something passing between them in that look. I want you gone from my property. I want Sterling unharmed, and I want enough of that gold to pay off my mortgage and keep this ranch running. That's not how this works, Harlan said. That's exactly how this works. Because if anything happens to me or Sterling, those journals get delivered to the territorial marshal, along with a letter explaining who came looking for this chest and what they threatened to do to get it. Sterling felt a surge of admiration for Clementine's courage, but he also knew they were walking a razor's edge. Men like Harlan didn't like being backed into corners. You're bluffing, Harlan said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Clementine walked to the edge of the porch and kicked at a loose board with her boot. The plank shifted, revealing a small space underneath. She reached down and pulled out a leather-wrapped bundle, thick with papers and bound with string. Robert's journals, she said, holding them up for everyone to see. 20 years of guilt written in his own hand. Every detail of the robbery, every name involved, every dollar spent. She looked directly at Harlan, including the real name of your employer. Harlan's composure finally cracked. Give me those journals. Not until we have an agreement. Sterling watched the tension ratchet higher as Harlan's men shifted positions, clearly preparing for violence. But something in Clementine's steady gaze seemed to give Harlan pause. This wasn't the desperate widow he'd expected to intimidate. "What makes you think I won't just take them?" Harlan asked. "Because I'm not the only one who knows what's in them. The banker in town has copies, so does the preacher, and the territorial marshal is expecting a letter from me next week." Clementine's voice was calm, measured. "If I don't send that letter, or if something happens to me, they'll know exactly where to look for answers." Sterling felt a mixture of admiration and fear as he realized how thoroughly Clementine had outmaneuvered them. She'd been prepared for this moment, possibly for years. "You've been planning this," Harlan said, his voice flat. "I've been protecting myself. When your husband confesses to murder and robbery on his deathbed, you learn to be careful about who might come looking for answers." Clementine tucked the journals back into their hiding place. "I know Robert was a killer and a thief. I've known for 2 years. But I also know he wasn't the mastermind. So what do you propose? Half the gold stays here, enough to pay my debts and keep this ranch running. The other half goes back to wherever it came from, along with my silence about who really planned that robbery." Clementine's eyes were hard as flint. "And you and your men disappear forever." Harlan was quiet for a long moment, calculating odds and consequences. Finally, he nodded to his men. "Load half the gold into our saddlebags, leave the rest." "Boss?" one of the men protested. "Do it," Harlan snapped. "We're not getting paid enough to start a war with the territorial authorities." As the men began dividing the treasure, Sterling moved closer to Clementine. "The journals. Do they really name the inside man?" She nodded grimly. "Railroad superintendent named Morrison. He's been covering his tracks for 20 years, eliminating anyone who could connect him to the robbery." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Robert wasn't the only one who died in an accident." Sterling's blood went cold as he understood the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about stolen gold. It was about a man powerful enough to order murders and make them look like accidents. "The copies you mentioned don't exist yet, but they will if Harlan's boss doesn't keep his end of the bargain." The dangerous game they were playing became clear to Sterling. One wrong move, and they'd both end up as victims of unfortunate accidents. Harlan secured the last of the gold into his saddlebags, his movements deliberate and careful. The remaining treasure sat in the chest on the porch, enough to save the ranch and give Clementine the security she'd never really had. Sterling watched the man's face, looking for any sign of treachery. "This doesn't end here," Harlan said quietly, mounting his horse. "Morrison won't be satisfied with half measures." "Then Morrison can come explain himself to the territorial marshal," Clementine replied. "I'm done being afraid of dead men's secrets." Harlan studied her for a long moment, then nodded with what might have been respect. "You're tougher than your husband ever was, Mrs. Shaw." He turned his horse toward the east. "But tough doesn't always mean safe." The 3 riders disappeared into the heat shimmer, leaving only dust and silence behind. Sterling stood beside Clementine on the porch, both of them watching until the figures vanished completely. "Will they really stay away?" Sterling asked. "For now. Morrison's smart enough to know when he's been outmaneuvered. He'll wait and see if those journal copies I promised actually materialize." Clementine sat down heavily on the porch steps, exhaustion finally showing in her face. "But he won't wait forever." Sterling looked at the remaining gold, then at the woman who'd just risked everything to protect them both. "What happens now? Now we finish digging that well. The cattle still need water and this ranch still needs to survive." She managed a tired smile. "At least now we can afford to keep it running while we figure out what comes next." "And the journals? Will you really make copies?" Clementine was quiet for a moment, staring out at the vast expanse of land that had cost so much blood to claim. "I already have. Sent them to a lawyer in Denver last month, along with instructions to release them if anything happened to me." She stood up, brushing dust from her dress. "Robert may have been a killer and a thief, but he wasn't stupid. He knew someday someone would come looking for that gold." Sterling felt a deep respect for the woman beside him. She'd carried the weight of her husband's crimes for 2 years, planning and preparing for this moment while struggling to keep the ranch alive. "Why didn't you just turn in the journals yourself? Clear your conscience and start fresh?" "Because that wouldn't have brought back the men who died in that robbery, and it wouldn't have helped the families who went hungry when the payroll was stolen." She picked up the chest, surprisingly heavy with its remaining treasure. "This way, at least some good comes from Robert's sins. The ranch survives, you have a job, and Morrison has to live with the fear that his crimes might catch up to him. As the sun began to set over the western horizon, Sterling returned to the well with his shovel. Water was still needed, and morning would bring new challenges. But for the first time since he'd arrived at the ranch, the future seemed possible. 20 feet down, the earth finally yielded what they'd been searching for all along: clear, cold water bubbling up from an underground spring. The well that had revealed so much death and deception would now sustain life. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where justice and redemption collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.